Good morning, welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is John Copps. I'm Managing Consultant at Mutual Ventures, and I'll be hosting today's conversation. This webinar, jointly run by Bevan Brittan and Mutual Ventures, aims to help you as NHS leaders and partners think through the challenges and opportunities of provider collaboratives. The Health and Care Act, which only received royal assent last week, marks a decisive moment in the shift to more joined up working. Collaboration is now the mode of operation for health and care, and it's having big implications on the way providers work. As NHS England describes them, provider collaboratives are partnership arrangements involving at least two trusts working at scale across multiple places. Acute and mental health trusts have been told that they must be part of at least one provider collaborative, whereas other providers that they should be. So now is the time to identify and secure your place in the new arrangements in your local area. So coming up, we've got what should be a great discussion with first-hand examples. And on our panel today, we have 4 speakers, which I'll be posing questions to. Before they introduce themselves, a note to you to use the on-screen Q&A facility, which is at the bottom of your screen, to ask any questions you have. If you leave your name, we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And those we don't, we'll aim to follow up after the session. And we'll also be sending you a copy of the recording. So let me turn to our panelists who will introduce themselves. James.
Hi, I'm James Barker. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Barnsley Healthcare Federation.
And Jeremy.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Jeremy Bard. I'm the Director of Strategic Commissioning and Partnerships at Barnsley CCG.
And hello, David.
Good morning. I'm just being prompted, a bit of a delay. Morning all, I am David Hawkins. I am now the Director of Corporate Infrastructure and Integration at Hounslow and Richmond Community Healthcare NHS Trust.
Carly.
Morning all, I'm Carly Caton. I'm a partner in the commercial healthcare team at Bevan Brittan, and I'm working jointly with Mutual Ventures on lots of integration and collaboration projects at the moment.
And Matt.
Morning all, I'm Matt Carter, Senior Consultant at Mutual Ventures. As Carly said, working in collaboration with Bevan Brittan, and I've been focusing on provider collaboratives for several years now.
Great, and so straight into this discussion, I'd like to give everybody a sort of chance to give a short response to an initial statement, just to sort of kick us off. So all NHS providers should become part of a provider collaborative in the interest of patients, and it's because where the power will lie in local systems. What's your reaction to that, James?
I think absolutely. I think provider collaboratives will be really important going forwards, and I think it gives us the opportunity to build an infrastructure that patients expect. Patients still expect it to be one NHS, and only tell their story once. I think collaboratives give us the ideal opportunity to do that.
Jeremy?
I'd agree with that. I suppose we also need to think through the role of the provider collaboratives vis-a-vis the role of the ICP and place partnerships as well, and make sure we're all working together to achieve the same set of objectives and not duplicating effort and not working against each other, always working for clear outcomes.
And Matt?
Personally, I think if we are to successfully address health inequalities and avoidable variation, then it's essential that different parts of the health system come together under collaborative arrangements.
What do you think, Carly?
I find the expression where the power will lie a little strange, because of what Jeremy said, really. It's sort of, I don't know, I don't know why they've used that turn of phrase. I totally agree that we need to get on and get the collaborations underway, but it's sort of saying these will be the most important, and I'm not sure that's always going to be the case.
So local situation matters. And David, how about your reaction?
Yeah, I think the COVID has taught us a lot about how we need to all work together for the benefit of the patients, mutual aid, etc. I suppose I'll be slightly controversial and say I think we all need to work together, not necessarily in a rigid structure of a provider collaborative. And my reason behind that is I'm currently doing a lot of work at place. So in a collaborative, take Northwest London, personally, and for me and my organisation, I'm less concerned about the population at the other side of Northwest London, for example, Barnet, than I am at my local population in Hounslow. So all for working together, but I'm not sure whether, as per the white paper, the provider collaborative in its truest sense is necessarily the right structure.
Right, interesting. And we'll come to that. And I know there's a number of local authorities who've joined this call. So perhaps they might want to ask some questions related to that later on. Matt, before we go further, can you put some of this into context, and what's the recent history of provider collaboratives and what's being said about them?
Yeah, partly touching on David's point, there is a wide range of terminology used to address provider collaboratives, and we're using provider collaboratives here as a sort of a catch-all. But as Carly alluded to, we've got place-based partnerships, we've got alliances, and there is sort of variation on the theme, and some of those are place-focused, some of them are system, some are focused on vertical integration, some are horizontal. I know in some parts of the country, provider collaboratives per se are presumed to be horizontal integration between acute trusts, but we have established provider collaboratives across the system focused only on community services, for example. And certainly over recent months, we're seeing quite a rapid increase in collaborative arrangements across different health sectors. So we're currently working on one between community, mental health and primary care. We've also seen acutes coming together with community services. And we're also seeing collaborations based on specific cohorts, specific pathways. But I think generally speaking, there is an acknowledgement not only of the mandate to move away from competition to collaboration, but the collaboration in and of itself is essential, certainly post-COVID.
That's really helpful. And so we'll turn to some examples in a minute, and the commissioner perspective as well. Carly, before that, where do provider collaboratives sit within the NHS legislative framework, and particularly the Health and Care Act that's just been approved?
Yeah, sure. So the statutory bodies that will be established by the Health and Care Act will be the Integrated Care Boards, which are replacing the CCGs, which will be abolished from the 1st of July, and the ICBs will take their place. And these will sit alongside integrated care partnerships, which also are more at place level and including the local authority and so on. And provider collaborative sits sort of beneath this, and not as a statutory body brought about by the Act, if you like, but brought about by a sort of diktat that providers should join one, either must or should, depending where you sit in the system. And they can be formed in a variety of different ways, which we can talk about later if we want to, but they aren't a sort of a statutory entity in themselves. They're sitting below the ICBs and the integrated care partnerships, and alongside place-based partnerships and alliances and other types of collaborations within the system, but across multiple places.
That's helpful, Carly. And I guess over the coming months and years, we're all going to have to get used to the new arrangements in the NHS. And I know the NHS is constantly in flux, but it does feel like there is significant movement at the moment. Perhaps I could turn to James and David now for some first-hand experience. So tell us a bit about your experience of being in part of a provider collaborative. So first of all, what spurred you to be part of it, and where are you up to? And maybe James first.
Sure. So obviously I work in Barnsley, and we've got a really strong history of partnership working. And we're really fortunate in terms of the structure that we've got in Barnsley. So we've got one GP federation, we've got one PCN, one community provider and mental health provider, one council, one hospital, and currently one CCG. So the ability to work together as a collective has always been really strong. It does give us a great advantage in Barnsley of being able to do things at scale. One of the things that I really noticed through COVID was the partnership working that we were doing with the community provider. So when we were looking at things like the vaccination programme, I had to make one phone call over to a colleague in Swift and sort of say, right, big task to get through and get sorted. What help and support can you provide? And it was done within that one phone call. And I think the idea of being able to have an alliance, which we're working on with Swift, so they're the community mental health provider, allows us to wrap some greater governance and infrastructure around that allows us to move at speed and make decisions quickly, but means that we can work together on the ground as well. So we're giving staff the freedom to work together and be collaborative and think outside the box. And I think that's the important bit for me in terms of how we get things on the ground working effectively.
And James, is that clinical collaboration? Is it administrative collaboration? Is it governance? What?
It's across the patch. So we've got clinical collaboration and we've got administrative collaboration. So we're currently in the process of forming a operational leadership team, which will bring together management and clinical staff to oversee how we're going to deliver on the objectives that we've set out. So one of the things that we've been spending time over the last few weeks doing is setting out what our priorities are for the next 12 months as a set of providers, as an alliance, what we're going to do. And that operational group will then be able to take that forward and actually deliver on the so what and the benefits that we want to be able to see.
And David, your experience of this, what excited you about a provider collaborative, and why are you part of that?
Sure. So if I go back to the strictest sense that Carly spoke about, where my organisation straddles two systems, North West London, South West London. We're part of a local care collaborative in North West London, which consists of essentially non-acute, so it's community and mental health. Interestingly, South West London they've almost made the decision that they're not going to have a non-acute collaborative. So quite interestingly, goes against the white paper. But if I take Matt's broader catch-all collaborative definition, I'm probably in at least now my fourth successful type arrangement. So probably started, the first one was probably about 7-8 years ago, and we actually formed a joint venture with local GPs. At the time, we were working through an outcome-based contract, and so the commissioners wanted preferred providers, and so we formed, as I said, that joint venture, had joint contract, etc. And that worked, but we probably didn't make as much of it as we probably could have done and should have done. We then had a slightly looser arrangement with another GP consortium, and that consisted of employing members of the consortium, and we've still got that in place. We provide a lot of back office functions, and we employ a lot of the staff for the consortium. So we'll have all heard all the new physios, etc., that are coming through primary care. Following that, probably due to commissioner requests and requirements, but generally with, as we started off today, putting the patient at the centre. So to have sort of a similar standard of service and specifications across the two neighbouring boroughs, we engaged in a partnership agreement with a local social enterprise or a community interest company. So that worked through there. And most lastly, we are now 1 month into a partnership agreement with the local acute trust, and we've got joint chair, joint chief exec, single exec team, etc. So quite a varied experience of this type of arrangements and collaborative working. And I haven't even mentioned my place-based stuff. I touched on it earlier, which is absolutely fantastic in Hounslow. Probably slightly ahead of the curve there. We've actually managed to pool resources, fund business cases. So lots of good work there, but there's lots of arrangements in place, but a less formal collaboration agreement there.
Well, I think that demonstrates that there's all sorts of flavours then of collaboration, both in terms of the types of organisations and the and what the arrangement actually looks like. We've got a question which I thought I'd come to, which is around hang on a second. So it's around what the definition of a provider is here. Maybe this is one for you, Carly. So our correspondent says, when you are the only NHS provider in the ICB, can you collaborate with the voluntary sector or the local authority?
Yes, so we were talking about that actually before we started the webinar, what the definition of provider is. And I think in terms of what the sort of provider collaboration guidance that's been published says is that acute and mental health trusts will be expected to be part of it, and any other sort of trust or non-NHS providers should take part in a collaboration like this where that benefits patients and it makes sense for the providers and the system. So I think the answer to the question is yes, absolutely, it can contain any other entity that it makes sense to join up with, really.
Mm-hmm. Can we turn now to the commissioner perspective? And Jeremy, that's a role you hold in the South Yorkshire and Bassetlaw system, but also in Barnsley. What's the commissioner's point of view of a provider collaborative, and what's your role?
Well, that's an easy question. So there's a lot of history in Barnsley, as James has been alluding to, in terms of the work we've been doing together in Barnsley as a place, as a borough. It's a very distinct borough, and James gave you some of the characteristics of that in terms of the organisations and the coterminosity of the organisations that are working within it. And we've got a very vibrant, I think, place partnership, all health and care organisations working together to deliver a clear set of outcomes for the people of Barnsley. We're undergoing a fair bit of change, aren't we, as we move into the new arrangements. So Barnsley becomes one place within the much larger South Yorkshire Integrated Care Board. We've been working across South Yorkshire, and whilst Bassetlaw drops off from the 1st of July, becomes just South Yorkshire. We're working together for a number of years as well, in that horizontal sense across that much wider geography. The role of commissioning will be changing. It's been changing really throughout the period of COVID. It was in COVID, I think the commissioners in many ways have become the conveners of place and the people who are trying to sometimes put the glue into the collaboration, helping organisations to work across a series of agreed pathways and work streams to deliver best results. So we've changed our focus from contracting, certainly very, very much so in South Yorkshire, to collaboration and helping people make the changes that we have collectively agreed on the right ones that will deliver the outcomes we want, and importantly help us to remain within our financial envelope in the future as well. An issue which is coming back onto the table in quite a big fashion for 22-23 and beyond. So the role of commissioning is changing. We probably won't be called commissioners for very much longer. I don't think we've quite decided what we will be called in the future, but the role has changed from commissioning via contracting to getting things done, collaborating, convening. It's the convening power, I think, of the commissioner that we're focusing on here. So I think across South Yorkshire, we've got 4 or even 5 horizontal provider collaboratives across a range of different areas. What we're focusing on today, with James being here, is the collaboration at place and alliance at place between community healthcare primarily and also our GPs and the primary healthcare teams that they have at their disposal. So that's vertical integration at place is what we're thinking about and talking about. And as a commissioner, I'm clear that we have an agreed range, we have a vision for Barnsley, we've got an agreed range of outcomes we want to deliver. I've got to focus on delivery by things you must do and the transformation that will take us to what we should be doing differently in the future. And for me, seeing organisations come together to want to pool resources and pool operational management to work within the context of the place plan as a whole, where all partners and the local authority engaged in setting the direction there, is a powerful way of making sure that we are able to maximise our impact at place, maximise the way those teams are working together, work together fantastically across the course of COVID, and want to build on that and make sure that as new resource comes into that, and the additional workforce in particular comes into primary care, we're working in a way that allows us to demonstrate we're doing well, make sure they're aiming and focusing in the right way and working to magnify their strengths rather than sometimes as they can be, not be fully aligned. So there's a lot of key things as a commissioner. Really happy to see progress. There are challenges there as well, John. We'll be able to come back to some of those.
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will. Thank you for that take as well from a commissioner. I mean, a commissioner as a convener is a very sort of, I mean, it's a really good way to think about the shift, I think. So I've got a question for everybody, which is if we could dig more specifically into what benefits we've all seen from provider collaborative, concretely, what benefits we've seen either for organisations or pertinently for patients as well. Who wants to go first? Perhaps David?
Oh, nothing like being put on the spot. Thanks, John. No, I mean, patients have got to be at the centre of all this. And, you know, at the outset, I said about how the pandemic has impact on it. And I think, I am very biased, but I'm from a community services provider. And I think finally, the pandemic has opened people's eyes as to how we are that crucial part in the system. So, you know, working closely, if I reflect on my most recent one with my local acute, it is that joint working, both trying to prevent people from being admitted into hospital and then working on the discharge type of things, let alone the mutual aid and sort of, you know, start cross governance staff. So, you know, it is all about the patient. So they've got to be the front and foremost. And similarly with primary care, I mean, primary care it's gone through significant changes also with the pandemic. And again, working with them, how we as two sort of subsets can also aid that patient journey and make sure it's sort of still high quality. So just putting the patient at the centre.
So David, are you able to say or are you able to say there's progress towards this, that the sort of NHS providers have become less siloed in their mentality?
In some cases, yes. I think we've moved slightly away, and there's a number of reasons for it, but from the competitiveness. So if my local community health provider, we often bid for, you know, same tenders, etc. So we were, you know, competing all the time. Now we work together. So as part of the non-acute collaborative I mentioned earlier, we come together as a force. So no, I've seen that move away from siloed organisations.
I mean, it's interesting the sort of history of collaboration and relationships between organisations, because some providers have history and others have previous. I sort of think about it. And have others encountered the situation of tension between providers, and how have you sort of managed that?
I can carry on there, John, if you want to give others a bit of talk time. So, no, at place level, you know, I mentioned earlier, so it doesn't sound a lot, but it's no mean feat having an acute, community, mental health, council, CCG and primary care all agreeing on priorities for the local population, priority business cases, and all putting their money, or all of us putting our money where our mouths are, and how I suppose I won hearts and minds. I stepped forward with some money because until a month ago I was the CFO. I stepped forward with some money, even though it didn't benefit my organisation. It benefited as a whole. So, you know, there's lots of ways you can sort of win hearts and minds and overcome those obstacles you just talked about, you know, previous history, etc.
James, on any thoughts from you, maybe on the history, but also on the benefits, concrete benefits you've seen?
Yeah, and there are and have been a number of benefits in Barnsley already in terms of the work that we're doing. As I mentioned, COVID and being able to mobilise staff and have staff sharing agreements in place very, very quickly. So again, people operating as one team. And I think for me, the bit, and this links back to the history, is building trust. So in terms of partners coming together and working as one, you need to have trust in the people that you're working with. And I think once you start to build that trust, then people can achieve more more together. So we've already started to do a lot of work with our community provider as part of the alliance. So they employ our first contact physiotherapists as part of the PCN and the mental health practitioners. And we're able to work with them very collaboratively in terms of they deliver mental health across Barnsley, and they deliver the MSK multiple services as well. So then you are creating that single pathway by having those links and people together. The other thing that we've been able to do is co-location some of the services. So we deliver out of hours services. Swift deliver the crisis response and overnight enabled nursing services, and so they are now located in one building. So you've got more resilience within the team and within the service. So if there are pressure points, as there have been over winter, we're working together as one to go out and see patients and work out where the best fit in terms of resource is, which again comes back to having patients at the centre of what we're doing. And hopefully patients won't necessarily see a difference in terms of it being one or two providers. It's because we're all working as one. As I said earlier, it's about creating the image that patients have of one NHS working together, which I think is again really important.
Mm-hmm. And Jeremy, from your perspective, what have you seen in terms of concrete benefits?
So James's point about trust, I think, is the key one. Trust and relationships, people, culture, skills. We spent quite a long time working together to develop a good set of relationships at a senior level. That's taken time to achieve. I think we're in a pretty strong place at the moment. I think one of the really big attributes of Barnsley as a place, though, is that at the front line where people are delivering services in people's houses, that Barnsley spirit has always been there in terms of the way people want to work together. So though we talk about the ambition of kind of having no borders and seamless integrated working, the reality at the front line is that people have worked in that way as best as they can throughout the entire time. And we've seen that particularly true in terms of COVID. So it's almost like it becomes seen. So we're working from kind of both ends. There's a lot of previous history in Barnsley, somewhat previous, somewhat history. But if you build on those trusted relationships, both at the front line and the ones we've worked to establish really hard and over the last few years at a senior level, then you end up in a place where you've got all healthcare partners working to achieve one end. This is an extent, the work that our colleagues are doing in terms of a vertical provider alliance is a step forward, I think, in that way. It is nonetheless not without its challenges, because when you have organisations that are going away and working together, even if they're in tune and aligned with the overarching plan that you have as a place, you have to make sure that there's real transparency and visibility about what they're doing, and real inclusion as well with other partners in any plans that are developed, which we want to mobilise and put in place.
So in a sense, in Barnsley, your experience is in part, the provider collaboratives have been an enabler to some of the relationships on the front line that were already there, and then has strengthened some of the senior relationships. Is that?
I think that's right. And looking ahead with the changes that are taking place, the way of working that we've got in Barnsley, I think, continues to draw in and maintain the interest of our primary care leadership as well. I think that's important, that we find a place for them to feel where they belong, and they've got a say in how services are being developed, particularly as all important out of hospital services, care close to home, which is one of our core strategic objectives for Barnsley as a place. Working together with another partner in terms of forming a closer governance set of arrangements through an alliance is important, as long as that remains in the context of that wider partnership agreement and ambitions, that transparency and the trusted relationships that you have to work hard to maintain. So it's a great thing, but it has its own challenges coming with it. And we will continue to work at a senior level to make sure that everyone's objectives remain aligned and understood.
Yeah. Okay, great. And so Carly and Matt, you've worked together in a lot of different places. So we've heard from James, David and Jeremy, empathy, less siloed, working as one team, building trust, single pathways, co-location. What benefits have you seen? What concrete benefits have you seen from provider collaboration?
Shall I go first, Carly? For me, I've definitely seen some benefits in terms of workforce. So increased opportunities for career development, greater freedom across wider portfolios, opportunities for sharing skills, establishing good practice, particularly where performance data is being shared. Is if one particular provider organisation is performing more successfully in particular areas, getting to the, why is that, and what lessons can we learn, and what can be shared across. It's never about finger pointing in that instance. Equally, and I think this has been critical during the recovery period from COVID, has been resilience. So even some of the larger providers might have some specific services with very small teams, and they've got increased capacity through the collaborative arrangements using resource and expertise from their partners.
Grand, that's really, and so Carly's disappeared, but I want to sort of move on to ask about, why don't we talk about key success factors from and then move on to some of the challenges of provider collaboratives. So what would you say really makes it work? What's the spark that makes it work? And so I'm kind of anticipating it's something we might have already mentioned, but what is it? What are the key success factors? Perhaps James first.
Yeah, and I think it does go back to a lot of the stuff that we've mentioned, and it's people and relationships. That's the key bit to all of this, is making sure that you have an open and honest relationship with those people that you're working with in whatever alliance or collaborative structure that you've got.
And what does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean you can pick up the phone to them? Does that mean you can have an argument with them and then be fine the next day? I mean, what's the...
Yeah, I think both of those points, there's got to be a position where you can talk about difficult issues. You're not always going to agree on absolutely everything, although you might have shared set of priorities and know where you want to go in terms of objective. But the two or more organisations might have different ways of getting to the same result, and you've got to be able to thrash that out without falling out and without sort of getting to a point where it's no longer working. That then goes back to the fact that you believe in the people that you're working with, and you can still have that robust relationship. And in Barnsley, we have had more difficult conversations around how we do things, the speed in which we're working, what's the role of primary care, how does primary care as 32 practices impact on the overall system. And you've got to be able to sort of stand there and take that challenge and present a solution back that's, again, open and honest.
And when you started at the outset, did the vision come easy? I mean, we've all sort of talked about the patient being the centre here. Did that come easy, or was it quite a sort of, not a battle, but a debate to get to something that you could all agree on?
I think that the priorities in Barnsley are clear. We've got a number of health inequalities, and as Jeremy mentioned, as a place-based system, we were quite quick to pull out the priorities that we wanted to focus on. The difficulty that you have is sometimes there are so many priorities and so many interdependencies in the work that is then difficult to boil down which ones we're going to do first. And that's where the challenge comes in terms of going, right, we're going to focus in on cardiovascular disease, we're going to focus in on COPD or frailty, and we're not then going to focus on diabetes as a group. There will still be work going on with diabetes as an example, but actually that's not our main focus. We're going to focus over here, and it's those conversations that are the most challenging, trying to whittle down what it is we can do within 12 months, which at the end of the day is a very short period of time.
And David, do you agree with that in terms of coming to a vision?
Yeah, very, very much so. And I think, I mean, it was touched on there, it's having the right people. So it's having that vision, but having that will. and if you are not quite having the same vision, for example, as I don't know, argument's sake, the CCG, it's not afraid to having that sort of those robust conversations. And I've lost my second train of thought.
That's all right. That's all right. One of the things you said earlier is that you used to wear the finance hat
Yes,
in this. So tell us a bit about that. How does finance play into the key success factors? How does that work, and what?
So yeah, I mean, you can make a difference. I have remembered my previous point. It's about not being afraid, and it's the link here. It's not being afraid to reset. Being, we if I think about the place arrangements, we spend a lot of time trying to get arrangements in place which such as the finance, with a lot of sort of GPs and primary care in the room about risk share. That was probably a mistake, and so we rewound and went down a different route. In terms of specifically finance, it's sort of the example I gave earlier, because obviously within due governance, if I was able to invest some money that maybe didn't impact on my specific sovereign organisation, it's seen that wider piece. It's just being able to having the, I suppose, the freedom and the empowerment to do that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Jeremy, so is the consent of the commissioner or the consent of the commissioner convener now a requirement for a successful provider collaborative?
I think that does still remain, but it remains in a different way to the way we've exercised it in the past. The whole point of the legislation, which is now passed and received royal assent, is that we are working in collaborative partnership across health and care providers and what we call commissioners of working together to set the direction for the system. So there is still a need to hold the partnership and the providers to account for delivery and transformation activities, but that holding to account doesn't sit with a commissioner. It sits with the organisations themselves and the arrangements that they put in place in each of their areas. In Barnsley, we've got a place partnership, as well as obviously in South Yorkshire, we have an integrated care board. So that's what, so accountability is shifting and moving in a different way, but it's still there. And the commissioner, as all the core people within those teams, will still be there working in place to assist them in coming to a judgment about whether delivery and transformation objectives are being achieved.
Mm-hmm. So if we talked about their vision, finance, trust and commissioning, is there any other key success factors that you'd want to pull out? Anyone?
If I may, for me, my experience, it's been governance. Obviously not the most appealing element of the work, but essential nonetheless. Not only in terms of being very cognizant of existing internal governance arrangements and requirements, and not least the differences in those arrangements between the provider organisations within the collaboration. For example, foundation trusts and their council of governors, etc. Whether you have senior independent directors, but in order to maintain a focus on improving outcomes, it is essential to have that decision making at the right level and as agile as possible. And in order to do that, you need to delegate the right level of authority to the right senior individuals in the collaboration, to whatever forum we've seen committees in common, provider boards, alliance boards, etc. And then equally as important, I think, is, given the examples we've already discussed of existing arrangements, is being sure that whatever new governance frameworks we put in place don't disrupt or duplicate other collaborative arrangements that are already in situ.
Carly, anything to add?
No, I think that's a really good point. Sorry, everyone, I keep dropping off it. I think it's fixed now. My computer was trying to restart itself, but I'm back now. And I think the governance issue can be quite a knotty one. It's really important to address it early on. It's different for the different organisations within the system, so we've got to make that align. And once that seems to be sorted and everyone's happy with it, you see things sort of jump forwards quite quickly. It really is a sort of enabler to the partnership working. So I think that's key to look at that. What are your current arrangements? How can you join up? And of course, under the Act, there will be some new ways that organisations can join together. Traditionally, we've used the different types of models like the lead provider model or a shared leadership model, but there
we'll come to that in a moment, Carly.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, well, thank you. That is a great point. So I've got another question, which I think this was Jeremy's phrase. Apologies if it wasn't Jeremy, but I think anyone can answer this. What do we mean by, when we talk about collaboration, having the right people in the room? And how do you take into account those people who aren't the right people?
So the right people in the room, well, it varies depending on the job in hand, doesn't it? So if you start at a place, you need to have the senior leadership of place in the room and committed to being in the room on a regular and ongoing basis, consistent attendance and a consistent understanding of what their role is in the place-based arrangements as well. And I think that's still a work in progress, probably everywhere, in terms of really getting crystal clarity around what that means. Otherwise, it's getting the right people in the room to achieve the task at hand, isn't it? So if you focus on a particular outcome, particular sales objective, then you need the people you know are going to deliver on your behalf and can show and demonstrate and evidence progress. There's never always the right people in the room. And if you have a mature place partnership, you find ways of working around that. Right. Okay. And I suppose it's also a question of having different stakeholders in different levels of stakeholders. And maybe, James, has the way you work now changed those level of stakeholders, or is it sort of much as it was before?
I think it's been an evolution, and I think Jeremy is right in terms of, it is always difficult to get the right people in the room, but I think there's also the recognition that when you realise that certain people aren't there, that they're invited as the earliest opportunity, so they can be part of that. I think that it's a fine balance in terms of getting the right people in the room, but not everybody in the room, so that it slows down sort of decision making and the way of working. But yeah, it's always a challenge, but I think there is always a way through, particularly if you know the system and know partners, you know who you can bring in and when.
Mm-hmm. And Carly, you want to make a point?
I was just going to say it can evolve as well, who the right people are, and we can set up arrangements in a way where it starts off being a certain combination of organisations, and with the flexibility to bring in new partners as well as we move forward. So that's important to bear in mind.
Yeah, and it's about collaboration, it's about partnership. David, you used the phrase hearts and minds earlier. So I guess the question is how you win hearts and minds.
So there's a number of ways. It's having that vision, making sure everybody is, to coin a phrase, bought into that vision. I think for me, it's getting our teams there as well. So my reflection is that in some of my workings, a lot of it was about language as well. So very different language used in health, as in social care as well. So so there are a number of ways through it, but it's also not being afraid to change. So my primary care director here will say, we sit in a room and have meetings about making decisions. Why can't we just make decisions? So there's frustrations there. So it's not being afraid to adapt and change as well. So maybe we can take a leaf out of that book and just make decisions. And what was a phrase? Beg forgiveness afterwards, I think.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, David. Carly, can we turn to that point you mentioned earlier around what are the different options for provider collaboratives, for setting up provider collaboratives, and what do they look like?
Yeah, sure. So there's always been a way of doing this. The Act hasn't sort of suddenly said you can do it and we couldn't before. We've been doing it for a long time. It's just the ways of doing it. There will be some new powers to form joint committees between organisations that didn't previously exist. The methods that we use to date can be anything from a lead provider model, where one organisation sort of takes the contract and then shares out some of the services with other providers sitting underneath in a subcontract type model. We've seen a shared leadership model, and we're seeing more and more of that. So joint chief executives, joint chairs between organisations, whole joint boards, or what people working towards that. So the organisations becoming more and more joint through the leadership of the organisations being joint. Or we see the committee in common structure where two or more organisations form a committee and they sit together in common at the same time. So essentially it's like a joint committee, but it's not a joint committee, it's a committee in common. And in that way, they're sort of making decisions in the room at the same time, if you like. So that's the sort of models we see. And obviously contractually, we have a collaboration agreement or a partnership agreement which sets out how the organisations will work together as well to sort of back that up and set out the governance and decision-making processes.
And David, perhaps your experience is, you mentioned, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 provider collaboratives, but they all look slightly different. And how easy was it to choose between those models?
So the early one, I think in hindsight, we probably didn't choose the right one. We had a joint venture arrangement. For those who remember, there was a model in Cambridgeshire that fell down because of the VAT implications. So at that point, that's the route we went down. I think we probably were in danger of losing some of our VAT status there. I'd say we've got all 3 of what Carlos just said. So we've got, so if I move on from the other primary care one, that's sort of more of a, whilst there's stuff in place, it's not as robust. So I've got 2 proper partnership agreements signed at the moment. One is the lead provider model, and then the subcontract with the local provider of community services in Kingston, and then we've got the leadership model with joint posts that I talked about earlier with an acute trust, and in both cases we've got the committee in common. So no, it's very varied, my experience and what's in place.
And can I ask, on a lead provider model?
Yeah.
So on the face of it, if you didn't know how these things work, it doesn't look like partnership. You know, on one of it. So how do you make that look like? How do you make that become a partnership and not just become somebody contracting to the other?
I think, as Matt will attest, that was probably one of the main topics of conversation. You know, it genuinely is a partnership, and there is danger of that role. So it's, you know, the ways around it are making sure that both parties are engaged in commissioning and contract conversations. We've developed joint quality dashboards. So whilst we have a lead performance and contract management arrangement, it's very much in a partnership type way rather than sort of a lead subcontract arrangement.
Mm-hmm. And can we talk about a few more issues around some of this, because I know this is important to people. So what happens? So a partnership's all very well when things are going swimmingly. What happens when it goes wrong? I don't know who wants to pick that up, but is there an example of you can give, perhaps?
As my mic's open, I'm happy to carry on. It's a bit like in anything, isn't it? So you try and resolve it locally, and then there are escalations in the partnership agreement. There are dispute resolution clauses and in there, but you know, you hope it doesn't get to that. We've got committee in common, and we've got sort of groups below that sort of escalate up. So you try and manage it at a more local level rather than sort of having to revert to the partnership agreement and the dispute resolution process is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about a change in personnel? Does anyone have examples of that, and what implication that might have, or have you thought about that?
Again, sorry, I seem to be dominating, but again, my example is my chief executive left. She was you know, leading a lot of this work the partnership agreements, I stepped into that role because I'd worked on it before, and my organisation in speech marks got it. I'd like to think there wasn't an impact. We're now into a new substantive chief exec, and I'd like to think that arrangement has continued. So as long as, you know, and going back earlier about, as long as that trust has been established and those working relationships are in place, then it shouldn't make, in my opinion, a huge difference if there's a change in certain key roles.
Yeah, thank you, David. And we have a question around, how do you build momentum once the collaboration is in place, and how do you keep the energy going? Maybe James, Jeremy, what thoughts on that, James?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it is difficult to keep things going. You know, there's obviously a lot of passion when you get something started. It's new, it's shiny, people want to be part of it. I think to keep things going, it's around engagement and not having a top-down approach, but obviously the people on the ground know what needs doing, and often know the best way to do that. So if you've got those people engaged, they can see that their input is being taken into account, and they are helping to move things forward. You help keep that momentum, keep that passion and drive going forwards. And I think that's the key bit for me.
I was going to say something very similar, actually, but I think on top of that, I think you need to invest in involvement and engagement with the public as well, about what it is you're doing, the differences you're making, how to listen carefully to the different diverse communities you have in your areas, so you're able to show that you are being inclusive, you know, in your approach. And I think from a workforce perspective, if you are again clear about the messaging and the impact that you're having to get together in terms of how you're delivering services in a different way, that momentum builds itself at the front line. That's the key thing. Really, the rest of us are attempting to be servants of place. So if your workforce are convinced this is the right way forward, and you're involving and engaging and listening to the local population, then that's how you build the energy to progress and keep things moving forward.
And we're coming up towards the end of our time, so I just want to ask a final question, and maybe 2 or 3 sentences from everybody on this. We've still got a little bit of time, so I'd like your sort of thoughts on this question. How will provider collaboratives change the NHS and services for patients in the future? Who wants to go first? Matt, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I'm increasingly seeing work across different health sectors under collaborative arrangements along entire pathways. And I know the NHS has talked about this for a long time, but I'm actually seeing it producing tangible benefits. So there's a greater understanding from all organisations along that pathway, the roles of each, and smoother transition, that seamless transition, that avoidance of duplication, identification of any perverse incentives, etc., all maintaining focus on patient outcomes and patient experience. And it genuinely feels like the first time that's being done, and done in a sustainable way. And it might be that you take a specific pathway and focus on that initially, and then take your learning from that and roll that out across subsequent pathways.
And Carly?
Yeah, I think we'll see a lot more of the sort of group models that we're seeing start to establish, and genuine joint working, and the sort of putting the partnership first and not the sovereign organisation first, which has sometimes happened in the past a little bit. Like, everyone thinks it's a good idea, but don't quite get it over the line when it comes down to the details. I think we genuinely will see a move forwards. I think there are some players within the system where it's trickier, specialist trusts particularly, where they don't quite fit in a place or an area or into one provider collaborative. So I think there'll be some things emerging there, but I do see for the first time this sort of true integration as we move forward.
And Jeremy, so again, the question, how will provider collaboratives change the NHS and services for patients in the future?
You'd hope the answer would be for the better, wouldn't you? I do think this is a totally novel approach, I have to say. I think we've been trying to work in partnership and together throughout the history of the NHS since 1948 in different ways and guises and forms. It's ultimately, doesn't matter what option you take, whether they can help to focus people's efforts and agree ambition. Ultimately, it's down to the people that we've got throughout our healthcare system wanting to work together to achieve the right things for their patients and citizens. This is a mechanism to do it. It's a good one, I think, but to make it carry on working will take the same commitment and energy as it ever has done to keep change happening.
Yeah, thank you. And James, if I could ask you to be a little bit briefer.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, hopefully you'll have a happier, more passionate workforce because you are working on things are happening, which in the end of the day will cascade down to patients. And I know in Barnsley, patients will tell you if you're doing it right, and they'll certainly tell you if you're doing it wrong as well. So,
good. And David, last thought to you on this.
Thanks, John. It's got to be for a positive thing, and it's probably ensuring that patients are treated in the right place at the right time, harboring all the technology that is available.
Thank you. So collaboration is firmly on the agenda, and as we've heard, provider collaboratives for the better. And ultimately what matters is what happens to patients. So better pathways, partnership first, and delivering the right care at the right time. So legislation can be an enabler of change, but what it's really about is that shared purpose, the vision, and providers going on the journey together in whatever form of collaboration suits your place. So moving quickly on that is key to make the most of strengths in your area and existing relationships, knowledge of people and places, as we've said. NHS England have said that provider collaboratives should be proportionate to the shared vision and objectives. And as we've heard, there's options here for the structure, governance, procurement of care, and providers must take care to find out what works for them and their patients and their people. So exciting times ahead then, but not without challenges. Our advice and experience is here to make use of from Bevan Brittan, Mutual Ventures and colleagues, and we'd be delighted to have further conversations with you. We'll circulate a copy of the talk for you to share with colleagues, and please do drop me or others on the panel a line if you want to. Finally, just to say a very warm thank you to our speakers for their time. Thank you to you for joining, and hopefully see you again soon.